They say a simple invitation can change everything. I thought it was just coffee, just a casual chat, just a harmless afternoon. But the words he spoke that day still echo in my mind. I wasn't prepared for how seen I'd feel or for the emotions that surfaced after years of quiet routine. This story isn't about betrayal. It's about a moment, a connection. A question that lingers long after the cup is empty. Before we dive in, tell me, from which city are you watching us today? I'd love to know where you're joining me from. Now let me take you back to the beginning. I was weeding the flower bed in front of the house when my phone buzzed in the pocket of my cardigan. The sun was soft that afternoon, just brushing against the tops of the hedges, and the neighborhood felt like it always did, peaceful, ordinary. I wiped the dirt from my gloves, pulled out the phone, and saw the message. Coffee. If you're free, just a quick break. Marcus. Marcus was my husband's colleague. They worked together at the firm for years. I'd seen him dozens of times at company picnics, retirement parties, the occasional dinner. He was polite, respectful, a bit reserved, but always warm in his tone. I hadn't thought much about him beyond those passing exchanges, but that day the message felt unexpected. I stared at it for a moment longer than I should have. We had chatted briefly last week at the annual fundraiser. It was one of those crowded, noisy events where everyone stands around with half-empty glasses of wine pretending to care about speeches and auction items. I had been standing alone near the dessert table, scanning for a familiar face when Marcus walked up beside me and said, "You always look like you don't want to be here." I laughed because it was true, and he smiled in that quiet way of his, one corner of his mouth curling more than the other. We talked for maybe 10 minutes about art, about how he'd taken up painting again after 20 years. I remember thinking how rare it is for someone to ask you about yourself and then actually listen. I hadn't realized how hungry I was for a real conversation until that moment. And now this message. I told myself it was innocent. It was just coffee. I hadn't had plans for the afternoon anyway, and besides I could use a break. That's what I told myself as I changed into a fresh blouse and combed my hair with more care than usual. Just coffee, nothing more. We met at a small cafe near the lake, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls. He was already there when I arrived, seated by the window with 2 cappuccinos on the table. He stood up when he saw me, and I noticed, not for the first time, how kind his eyes were, the type that make you feel like the only person in the room. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," he said as I sat down. "I wasn't sure either," I admitted, smiling. We sipped coffee and talked about everything and nothing, about the neighborhood, about our favorite places to travel, about how time changes people, sometimes in quiet ways you don't notice until someone else points it out. His voice was calm, steady, not flirtatious, not bold, but sincere, grounded. "I always wondered," he said at one point, his fingers circling the rim of his cup, "what you really thought of all those corporate parties. You always looked like you were somewhere else entirely." I laughed again. "That obvious, huh?" "Not obvious, just different. You've always seemed more thoughtful than most people in the room, more observant." I liked that. His compliment caught me off guard. It wasn't laced with charm or wrapped in innuendo. It felt honest, and suddenly something in me softened. We were both in our 60s, both married, both well-versed in the rules of what you say and don't say. But in that moment, the conversation began to feel like something else entirely, like a shared confession whispered into a quiet space that didn't quite belong to the real world. He asked me if I ever thought about things I didn't say, words I'd swallowed over the years. "Sometimes I wonder what life would have been like if I'd made different choices," he said. "Not regrets, just possibilities." And that's when something shifted. As I had wondered too. Not because I was unhappy. My marriage had its rhythms, its quiet companionship. But over time, the excitement faded into routine. I'd gotten used to not being asked how I felt. Not in the deep aching way that made you stop and really think. It had been years since anyone looked at me like that. Not as a wife, not as a mother, not as a familiar fixture at someone's side, but as a woman with stories still untold. Didn't say that out loud, but I think he saw it in my eyes. The cafe grew quieter as the afternoon slipped by. People came and went. The sunlight shifted on the floor. We lingered, reluctant to let the moment end. When I finally stood to leave, Marcus reached out and gently touched my arm. Just a brush of his fingers, light as a question. "Thanks for coming," he said, voice low. "This meant more than you know." I nodded, but inside something had stirred awake. I walked back to my car with the weight of his words still in my chest. The conversation hadn't crossed any lines, but emotionally, it had opened a door I hadn't even known was still locked. And the echo of that door opening followed me all the way home. I didn't tell my husband about the coffee. Not because I was hiding anything, not really, but because I wasn't sure how to explain it. How do you describe a conversation that didn't break any rules, and yet somehow meant something? Something you're still unpacking yourself? That evening, as we sat on the porch sipping our usual chamomile tea, he told me about the client meeting that ran late and how Marcus had offered to stay behind and help with the final numbers. I nodded along, keeping my face neutral, pretending I didn't know about Marcus's day. Pretending I hadn't shared something quiet and intimate with him just a few hours earlier. I watched my husband talk, his voice calm, his gestures familiar, and for the first time in a long time, I realized just how much I'd memorized him. Every sigh, every pause, every glance. He hadn't changed much. Not on the outside, but somewhere along the way, the conversations between us had become shallow pools instead of rivers. Functional, necessary, safe. I found myself thinking about that touch on my arm. Not the contact itself. It wasn't romantic, not truly, but the intent behind it. The way it made me feel seen, acknowledged. It was strange how something so small could linger for so long. The next few days passed in a strange haze. I kept busy, gardened, ran errands, went to my book club, where we discussed a novel none of us had actually finished. But beneath it all, that quiet echo hummed beneath my ribs. Then a few days later, another message. Stopping by the gallery today. Thought of you. You once said you loved watercolor. No invitation, no pressure, just a thought, just him offering a thread. I stared at the screen for a full minute before typing back. Which one? He replied with the name of a small local space near downtown. I had passed it before but never gone inside. It felt like one of those things I'd always meant to do but never got around to, the kind of thing you silently file under. Maybe someday. That afternoon, I told my husband I was going to check out a new exhibit. He nodded absently from behind his laptop, barely looking up. Have fun, he said. And I did, strangely. There was no lie in my voice, no guilt in my chest, just a strange flutter of anticipation I hadn't felt in a very long time. The gallery was quiet, cool and clean and filled with soft light. I spotted Marcus near the back, standing in front of a piece that looked like sunlight had spilled across paper. He turned as I approached and smiled. That same gentle smile that somehow made everything feel unhurried. I thought you'd like this one, he said, motioning toward the watercolor. I stood beside him, letting the colors sink in. Pale yellows bleeding into soft oranges, blues that melted into nothingness. It felt like a memory or a dream. It reminds me of early mornings, I said. Before anyone's awake, when the sky's just thinking about being a color. He looked at me, eyes thoughtful. Exactly. We wandered the gallery in near silence after that. Occasionally speaking, pointing out pieces we liked, but mostly we just walked together in that quiet suspended space between reality and imagination. As we stood before a piece that featured a single empty chair beneath a window, he turned to me. Do you ever feel like you disappeared somewhere along the way? His words landed so softly I almost didn't hear them, but they struck something deep, something raw. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at the painting, at the sunlight spilling across the floor, at the chair that waited for no one. I used to, I said quietly. Sometimes I still do. He didn't respond, not with words. But the look he gave me, it wasn't pity. It wasn't admiration. It was something in between. Something that said, I see it too. We sat outside the gallery afterward on a bench under the soft shade of a maple tree. The air was warm, the breeze gentle. We didn't talk much. It wasn't needed. The silence between us had started to feel like its own kind of language. Eventually, I glanced at the time. I should go, I said. I told him I'd be home before dinner. Marcus nodded. Of course, but then he hesitated. I hope you don't feel uncomfortable about this, about us talking. I turned to face him. No, I said honestly, I don't, because I didn't. There was no scandal here. No betrayal, just two people, grown, weathered, quietly aching, who had found an unexpected connection in the stillness of their lives. We stood. He walked me to my car, and just before I got in, he said, You know, it's not often someone makes you feel like you matter. Not really. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. Driving home, I thought about that chair beneath the window, how it stood alone, full of light and emptiness, And I wondered how many of us were waiting for someone to notice the sunlight at our feet. That night, after dinner, I stood at the kitchen sink washing the same dishes I'd washed 1,000 times before. The clink of plates, the warm water, the soft murmur of the television from the living room where my husband sat. Everything felt familiar, safe, predictable, and yet I couldn't stop thinking about that bench outside the gallery, about the way Marcus's words had settled into my skin, lingering like a warmth I hadn't realized I missed. I didn't feel guilty. That surprised me, because it wasn't a secret affair or some foolish indulgence. It was a quiet understanding, a recognition. Marcus hadn't touched me. He hadn't said anything improper. But still there was something there. A tension not of passion but of truth, of possibility. The next day, I opened the drawer in my nightstand and found the old sketch pad I hadn't used in years. I used to draw before the kids, before the noise and the routine and the endless laundry. I'd sketch in the mornings when the sun hit the table just right. Fruit bowls, tree shadows, the shape of my husband's hand while he read the paper. It had been years since I'd drawn anything, but I opened it now, flipping past pages of half-finished sketches and faded pencil strokes until I found a blank one, and I started to draw. At first it was just the chair from the gallery. That same empty seat under the imaginary light of a window I'd never stood beneath. But then I added a second chair, just barely angled toward the first. A conversation in posture, not words. Something had changed, not just in me but around me. Or maybe I was finally noticing what had always been there. The following week, Marcus and I didn't speak, no messages, no casual invitations, nothing inappropriate or dramatic, just silence. And I missed him. That shocked me more than anything. Not because I needed excitement but because I realized how deeply I craved being understood. It wasn't that my husband didn't love me. He did in his way. Our life together was built on decades of loyalty, shared responsibilities, the comfort of knowing someone's rhythm before they speak. But somewhere along the way we'd stopped asking each other the deeper questions, stopped seeing each other beyond what needed to be done. And then came Saturday. We were at a company function, another bland affair, in a rented banquet hall, with dry chicken and polite laughter. I wore a navy blue dress I hadn't pulled from the closet in years. As I stood near the back sipping flat champagne, and wondering how long I had to stay, I felt a presence behind me. I didn't expect to see you tonight. I turned. Marcus stood there dressed simply in a charcoal suit, his eyes calm but sharp. I came with Richard, I said. He wanted to make an appearance. Marcus nodded. I'm glad you did. We spoke quietly in the corner of the room, just two familiar faces among many. No one noticed. No one cared. The clamor of conversation gave us privacy. You've been quiet, he said after a moment. So have you. I didn't want to cross any lines. I looked at him, the way his shoulders tensed just slightly, the way his hands were tucked loosely into his pockets, like he didn't quite know what to do with them. There aren't lines, I said carefully. Not unless we draw them. He nodded, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned in just slightly, not close enough to alarm. Just enough that I could hear his voice more intimately than before. Can I ask you something? Yes. When was the last time someone asked how you really are? I froze. Not because it was a dangerous question but because it wasn't. It was devastating in its honesty. I don't know, I whispered. Maybe no one ever has. He stepped back as if giving me space to breathe. We didn't speak much after that. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of clinking glasses and forgettable small talk, but that one question stayed with me. You nod at me. Back home, as I changed into my robe and brushed my hair in front of the mirror, I looked at myself differently. Not with criticism, not with regret, but with a strange sort of curiosity. Who was I now? After all these years of being a wife, a mother, a hostess, a listener, who was I to myself? Marcus hadn't made any move. He hadn't flirted. He hadn't needed to. What he offered wasn't romance. It was space, a mirror, a conversation I hadn't known I needed. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the drawing, about those two chairs angled toward one another, and I wondered for the first time in years what I would say if someone really asked me, "How are you?" Really? Not fine, not tired, not busy. But the truth was this. I felt alive, nervous, seen. I felt like something had shifted inside me. Not toward someone else, but toward myself. And I wasn't ready to let that go. The next morning was unusually quiet. The light that crept in through the bedroom curtains had a softer hue, and the house felt suspended, like the world was holding its breath. My husband was still asleep, his breathing deep and rhythmic beside me. I watched him for a moment, that familiar profile I'd shared a lifetime with. He looked peaceful, unburdened, but I was anything but. I got up without waking him and went to the kitchen. I poured myself a cup of coffee the way I always did. Same mug, same chair by the window. But something inside me had shifted. And suddenly this space, once filled with habit, felt smaller, like it no longer fit. Marcus didn't message that day, and I didn't expect him to, but I thought about him constantly. Not because I longed for him, not in the way one might think. What lingered in my mind wasn't desire. It was awakening. A sense of having been nudged awake after years of emotional sleepwalking. Later that week, I ran into him by chance. Or maybe it wasn't chance at all. It was at the farmer's market. I was reaching for a basket of pears when I heard a familiar voice say, "You always pick the ones with spots." I turned. There he was, smiling. Casual, calm, like we'd always known we'd see each other again. "They're sweeter," I said, holding up a freckled pear. "I figured you'd say that." We stood there for a moment, the buzz of the market around us fading into the background. The weight of our previous conversation hung gently between us like something unfinished. "How you been?" he asked. I hesitated, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I did. "I've been thinking," I said, "a lot." "Me too." We walked the aisles together, not touching, not brushing shoulders, just existing side by side. We talked about nothing at first: prices, recipes, weather. But eventually we slowed near a quiet corner of the market, beside a small booth that sold hand-thrown pottery and delicate ceramic bowls. Marcus picked up one with a slight chip in the rim. I always like the imperfect ones best. I looked at him, and for the first time I allowed myself to say it. "I'm not unhappy," I said quietly, "but I think I've been lonely in a way I couldn't name." His gaze met mine. "I know exactly what you mean." We didn't say anything more for a long time. There was no plan, no dramatic decision, no secret pact or reckless abandon. What passed between us wasn't scandal. It was truth. And in that moment it felt like the most honest thing I'd shared with anyone in years. I bought the chipped bowl. At home, I placed it on the kitchen shelf in plain view. My husband never asked about it. He never noticed the new shape in our familiar space. But I did. It reminded me not of Marcus but of myself. Of the part of me that still craved expression, attention, connection. The part one had buried beneath years of duty and silence. The part one was ready to reclaim. Over the next few weeks I started changing little things. I joined a community art class. I set boundaries where I hadn't before. I opened conversations with my husband that didn't begin with, "What do you want for dinner?" I never told him about the coffee, about the gallery, about the market. Because in truth, the story wasn't really about Marcus at all. It was about the way he looked at me and saw a whole woman, not a wife, not a role, not a routine, just me. He didn't fix my marriage. He didn't break it either. He simply reflected something back to me that I had forgotten. I was still here. And maybe that was the point. Sometimes the most powerful moments in life aren't the ones that explode. They're the ones that unfold slowly, gently, shifting our view of ourselves forever. So when people ask if anything happened between us, I say yes, something did happen. I came back to myself, and for that I'll always be grateful.